Blood has a smell that changes with time. Fresh, it carries iron and warmth, the living scent of a body still fighting. An hour old, it thickens into something copper-sweet, cloying at the back of the throat. By the time it dries on metal, it becomes something else entirely. Something flat and mineral like rust made from the inside of a person. Darwin knew this the way most people knew the smell of bread or wood smoke. It was the first lesson her mother ever taught her, standing beside a field surgeon's table at age 9, watching Enid Wynne press a cloth to a border patrolman's opened shoulder and explain, calmly and without flinching, that the color and smell of the blood would tell them everything they needed to know about the wound beneath it. Dara had not flinched either, not then, not in the 16 years since. She knelt in the mud outside the king's command tent and turned the pauldron over in her hands. The left one, the one that covered his bad shoulder, though she did not know about the shoulder yet. She knew only that this piece was always the worst. Whatever he did in battle, he led with his left side forward, and the pauldron caught the bulk of it. Tonight's blood was thick and dark, concentrated in the joint where the plate overlapped, worked into the leather strap beneath where it had soaked through and begun to dry against the buckle. She dipped her scrub brush into the bucket of lye water and began. Around her, the war camp settled into its nightly sounds, soldiers coughing in their tents, the low murmur of sentries changing shift along the northern perimeter. Somewhere behind the supply wagons, a horse stamped and blew through its nose, and the farrier's boy spoke to it in the soft nonsense language that horses seemed to understand better than anything spoken with intention. The fires had burned down to coals along the camp's central lane, and the sky above the tree line was the particular deep bruised blue of a northern autumn night that would not fully darken until well past midnight. Dara worked by firelight and feel. She had cleaned this armor 4 times now, and she knew its landscape the way a farmer knows a field. Every dent had a story she could not hear but could read through her fingertips. The gouge across the breastplate's lower edge, where something had struck hard and glanced downward. The scratches along the right vambrace where the metal had been scraped against stone. The places where the original armorsmith had reinforced weak points with riveted plates, each rivet a small raised moon under her thumb. She had not been asked to clean it. She had not been asked to do anything except what the camp quartermaster assigned her when she arrived 2 years ago, stumbling in with the other refugees from Aldenmere after the border raid turned the village into ash and silence, laundry, water hauling, whatever needed doing that required hands and no particular skill that the army valued. She had been assigned her place, a bedroll in the camp followers section, a daily ration, a function. She was an Omega without a pack in a war camp full of soldiers who had more pressing concerns than one quiet woman with raw hands and a braid that never came undone. She did what she was told. She kept her head down. She survived the way her mother had taught her to survive anything, by making herself useful and making her usefulness invisible. Then, 6 weeks into the autumn campaign, after the battle at Greymarch Crossing that killed 37 soldiers and the king's armorsmith and left the camp's healers working through 2 straight nights, she had walked past the king's command tent and seen his armor. It was piled outside the tent flap. Breastplate, pauldrons, vambraces, greaves, the heavy leather gorget stiff with dried blood, just left there, discarded like something that had served its purpose and no longer mattered. The attendant who normally handled it had been reassigned to stretcher duty 3 days before, and no replacement had been named because in a war camp, after a battle that kills 37 people, the king's dirty armor is not anyone's priority. Dara had stopped. She had looked at the armor. She had looked at the blood drying on it, going from dark red to the flat brown black of something that would become permanent if it was not addressed soon, and her hands had itched, not metaphorically. Her actual hands, the muscles in her fingers and the skin across her palms, had responded to the sight of blood on a surface the way they had been trained to respond since she was 9 years old. Blood on the outside means harm on the inside. Find the blood, clean the blood, assess what is beneath. She had carried the armor to the wash station, drawn water, found lye soap, and cleaned it. Every piece, every strap, every buckle and rivet and joint where the plates overlapped and the blood had worked its way into the seams. She oiled the leather. She checked the rivets for looseness. She dried the metal with clean rags and left it outside the tent, reassembled in the correct order for donning. No one had seen her do it. No one had asked. The next night, after the skirmish at the northern ridge, the armor was outside the tent again, bloodied, abandoned, and Dara's hands itched again, and she cleaned it again, and again she left it reassembled and ready. By the fourth night, which was tonight, she had stopped pretending there was a reason beyond the one she would not name. She cleaned his armor because cleaning was the only language her hands still spoke fluently, because blood on metal was a problem she could solve, and most problems in her life were not, because the act of removing blood and restoring order to something damaged was so close to healing that her body could not tell the difference. And in the absence of actual patience and an actual practice and an actual life that the border raid had burned to nothing, this was what remained. She worked the brush into the joint of the left pauldron and watched the lye water turn pink. The blood released in stages, the surface layer first, then the deeper layer that had worked into the grain of the leather, then the last stubborn traces in the rivets that required a folded cloth and patience. Her fingers were cracked across the knuckles from the lye. The skin between her thumb and forefinger on both hands had split and healed and split again so many times that it had taken on a permanent raw pinkness, tender to the touch. She did not wrap them. Wrapping reduced her feel for the work, and feel was everything. She was reaching for the breastplate when she heard the tent flap move. She did not look up. She had learned in 2 years of camp life that the safest response to any sound near the command tent was to remain still and small and occupied. Soldiers passed through. Officers came and went. The king himself came and went, though she had seen him only at a distance until now, a tall, broad shape in dark armor moving through the camp with the particular unhurried stride of a man who had long ago stopped being impressed by urgency. The footsteps that came through the tent flap were heavy. They stopped 2 paces from her, and then they stopped entirely. Dara kept scrubbing. The breastplate had a smear across the sternum that was not blood. Some other substance, thick and dark, possibly mud mixed with something organic. She worked at it with the brush, then switched to a cloth when the brush moved it but did not lift it. The silence held. The footsteps did not resume. Whoever was standing 2 paces from her was simply standing there, watching. She knew who it was. The command tent was the king's. The soldiers on sentry duty would not stand and stare. The officers announced themselves. Only one person would stand in silence outside his own tent and watch an Omega clean his armor without speaking, because only one person owned the armor she was cleaning. Dara finished the sternum. She moved to the lower edge of the breastplate, where the gouge mark collected grime. She worked the cloth into the groove with her thumbnail, felt the metal's resistance, adjusted her angle. The king stood and watched. He did not speak. He did not move closer. After a duration that Dara measured by the progress of her work rather than by any sense of passing time, the footsteps resumed. They moved past her, around the side of the tent, and faded into the sounds of the camp. Dara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. She looked down at her hands. They were steady. The breastplate was clean. She finished the remaining pieces, oiled the leather, checked the buckles, and left the armor assembled outside the tent flap. She carried her bucket and brush back to the wash station, emptied the pink water into the drainage ditch, and hung the brush on its nail. She walked back to the camp followers section, crawled into her bedroll, and lay awake, listening to the sounds of a war camp trying to sleep. He had seen her. He had stood there and watched her hands move over his armor, watched her work blood from the seams of something that covered his body. And he had said nothing. He had not told her to stop. He had not asked what she was doing. He had not called for a sentry or told her she had no business near the command tent. He had watched, and then he had walked away. Dara closed her eyes. Her hands throbbed. The lie had done its work on the armor and on her skin in equal measure. She curled her fingers into her palms and felt the raw places protest. Tomorrow there would be another battle, or another skirmish, or another patrol that came back bloody. Tomorrow the armor would be outside the tent again because the war did not stop, and the king did not stop, and the blood did not stop. Tomorrow her hands would itch, and she would kneel in the mud and she would clean it, because that was what she did now. That was who she was in this camp. The woman who washed the blood from the king's armor. The woman no one had asked. She did not know his name. She knew the shape of his armor the way a blind woman knows a room. She knew which strikes he favored by where the blood concentrated. She knew his left shoulder was the problem, by the way the leather strap beneath the pauldron showed more stress than the right. She knew he fought hard and close and did not retreat, because the blood was always the front of the armor, never the back. She knew everything about his violence and nothing about him. She slept. The camp slept, and somewhere in the command tent, a king who had not spoken stood in the dark and looked at his hands, thinking about a woman who knelt in the mud and cleaned what he could not. 9 nights, 9 battles or skirmishes or patrols that ended in blood, and 9 times the armor appeared outside the command tent, and 9 times Dara cleaned it. She developed a system. She filled her bucket at the well after the evening meal while the soldiers were eating and the wash station was empty. She kept her brush and rags in a canvas roll beneath her bedroll, tucked alongside the folding knife that was the only possession she had carried out of Aldenmere. She waited until the fires burned low and the sentries settled into their routes before walking to the command tent, because the fewer people who saw her, the fewer questions she would have to not answer. The armor told her about each day's fighting, the way a patient's body told a healer about each day's living. She could read it now. The 7th night, the blood was concentrated on the right vambrace and the gauntlet, which meant close fighting with the weapon arm extended. A slash or a thrust that met resistance. The 8th night, the breastplate had taken an impact hard enough to crease the metal inward along the sternum, and the blood was someone else's, spattered in a pattern that spoke of a killing blow delivered at close range. She had pressed her fingers into the crease and felt the metal's memory of force and thought about the ribs beneath it, about the breath that must have been driven out of him when whatever struck had landed. The 9th night, which was tonight, there was less blood than usual. A minor skirmish, perhaps. Patrol contact. The armor showed scuffing and dirt more than gore, and the left pauldron strap, the one she had noticed wearing thin 3 nights ago, had finally torn. The leather was old. It had been repaired before, a neat line of stitching where someone with skill had extended its life. But the stitching had given up, and the strap hung by a remaining inch of frayed hide. Dara set the pauldron aside. She cleaned the rest of the armor in her usual order, working from the most damaged piece inward, saving the simplest cleaning for last when her hands were tiring and her attention wanted to drift. She oiled the leather, she checked the buckles, she laid the clean pieces in their assembly order outside the tent flap. Then she picked up the pauldron with its broken strap and took it back to her bedroll. She had no leather working tools, she had no replacement strap. What she had was the folding knife, the canvas roll, and the particular problem-solving instinct of a woman who had spent 2 years making do. She cut a length of heavy canvas from the bottom of an old supply sack she had been keeping for rags, measured it against the broken strap, and trimmed it to match. She folded it twice for thickness, punched holes with the tip of her knife, and stitched it into place using a length of waxed thread she had pulled from a discarded boot 3 days ago. The repair was not elegant. It was not the work of an armor smith, but it was tight, it was strong, and it would hold until proper leather could be found. She returned the pauldron to the assembly outside the tent. She positioned it exactly where it belonged, the repaired strap facing outward where he would see it when he donned the armor in the morning. She did not know why she had done it. She had crossed a line that she had drawn for herself without ever articulating it. Cleaning was one thing. Cleaning was removal. Cleaning was taking away what did not belong, restoring something to its correct state. Repair was different. Repair was addition. Repair was deciding that the thing mattered enough to fix, that its continued function was worth her time and materials, and the particular investment of care that came with putting her hands on something and making it better. She had repaired the king's armor. She had touched it with intent beyond cleaning. And she knew, standing in the dark outside the command tent with waxed thread still under her fingernails, that the line she had drawn was gone and would not be drawn again. Dara walked back to the camp followers section. She washed her hands in the water barrel, wincing as the cold hit the cracked skin, and crawled into her bedroll. She did not sleep for a long time. In the morning, the camp stirred before dawn. Dara rose with the other followers, ate her ration of porridge and salt pork, and walked to the wash station to begin the day's laundry detail. She was wringing a soldier's shirt when she saw the king cross the central lane. She had seen him at a distance before. She had cleaned his armor enough times to know his shape, but the shape she knew was iron and leather, not the man beneath. He walked differently without the plate. Lighter, though still with the rolling stride of someone whose body had adapted to weight and now felt its absence as a kind of buoyancy. He wore a dark wool tunic over leather breeches, the sleeves pushed past his forearms, and even from 30 paces she could see the scars, white and silver against the deep, dark brown of his skin, crossing his forearms in the particular crisscross pattern of defensive wounds healed and reopened and healed again. His left arm moved differently from his right, a slight restriction in the upward range, and she understood now what the shoulder scar she had felt through the armor actually meant. He was talking with Captain Revka Thane, who walked beside him with the loose-limbed ease of someone accustomed to matching his stride. Revka was pointing toward the northern ridge, and Alaric was listening with his head tilted slightly to the left, the posture of a man who gave his attention the way other people gave gifts, fully and without reservation. Dara watched for 3 seconds. Then she looked down at the shirt in her hands and wrung it until her forearms ached. She did not look up again as he passed. She did not need to. She had what she needed. The image of him walking without his armor, lighter and more human than the iron shape she tended every night, settled into her mind and stayed there like a splinter she could not reach. That evening, after the patrol returned with 2 wounded and 1 dead, Dara went to the wash station and found a jar of salve sitting on the shelf beside her brush and canvas roll. It was a healer's salve, the kind used for cracked hands and raw skin, a mixture of rendered fat and herb extract that she recognized by smell before she opened the lid. Her mother had made the same salve. The scent of it, sharp and green beneath the fat, hit her so hard in the chest that she stood motionless for 10 seconds, holding the jar and breathing through her mouth until the feeling passed. She looked around the wash station. No one. The jar had no marking, no note, no indication of who had left it. But there were only 2 people in this camp who would recognize healer's hands, and one of them was herself. Dara worked the salve into her knuckles and the cracked skin between her fingers. The relief was immediate, a cooling that sank beneath the rawness and softened the tight, splitting edges of the cracks. She closed her eyes. Her hands stopped hurting for the first time in weeks. She cleaned the armor that night with salved hands, and the work felt different. Not easier, because the blood was the same, and the lie was the same, and the labor was the same. Different because her hands did not ache while she did it, and the absence of pain made room for something else to occupy the space where the aching had been. Attention, maybe, or care. Something that had always been present in the work, but had been masked by the simple physical cost of doing it. She cleaned the left pauldron and checked her repair. The canvas strap held. The stitching was intact. He had worn it into patrol, and the repair had survived a full day of movement and combat. She allowed herself a single small feeling about this. She did not name it. She cleaned the feeling the way she cleaned the blood, working it out of the visible surfaces and into the deeper places where it would not show. The next 3 days passed in the rhythm the campaign had established. Skirmishes at dawn, patrols through midday, wounded filtering into the healer's tent through the afternoon, the dead buried at dusk in the field behind the eastern tree line. No markers, no ceremony beyond the brief words Alaric spoke over each grave himself, never delegating the duty, never shortening the words even when the count climbed. Dara watched from the laundry station. She watched from the water well. She watched from the edges of the camp where her duties took her and her invisibility allowed her to remain. She was building a portrait of the king, one detail at a time, the way her mother had taught her to build a portrait of a patient through observation before ever touching them. He ate with the soldiers, not in his tent. He served himself from the same pot and sat on the same ground and used the same dented tin bowl. He listened more than he spoke, and when he spoke, people leaned in rather than pulling back, which told her that his words carried weight because they were rare rather than because they were loud. He knew names, not just the officers, but the soldiers, the sentries, the farrier's boy. He asked after injuries by their specifics, not in the general way of a commander checking readiness, but in the particular way of someone who remembered which soldier had taken a cut to the forearm 2 days ago and wanted to know if the stitches were holding. She watched Captain Revka Thane watch him with the particular alertness of someone who had been doing it for years and had never stopped being worried about what she saw. Revka covered for him when his left arm stiffened after long days in armor. She positioned herself on his left in formations, shielding the weak side without being asked. She was his right hand operating on his left, and the efficiency of their partnership told Dara that whatever Alaric carried, Revka had been helping him carry it for a long time. She watched Master Healer Oren pause at the wash station one afternoon and glance at her hands. The old man's eyes moved from her reddened knuckles to the jar of salve on the shelf to her face, and something in his expression shifted. Recognition, perhaps. The particular recognition of one healer identifying another, the way 2 musicians might hear each other's training in a single phrase. He asked if her mother had been a healer. The words arrived simply and without preamble, the way a healer asks a question when the diagnosis is already formed and only the confirmation is needed. Dara said nothing. The silence lasted 4 heartbeats. Oren nodded once, as if the silence itself was sufficient answer, and walked away. He did not ask again, but the salve jar, when it emptied, was replaced by a full one in the same spot, and Dara understood that some conversations do not require words to reach their conclusion. On the 12th night, the armor was heavier than usual. Not physically, though the blood was thick across the breastplate and both vambraces and the gorget and the greaves and even the back plate, which was almost never bloodied because the king did not turn his back. Heavier because Dara had heard the numbers. 14 dead, 23 wounded. The enemy had pushed through the northern line for the first time in 6 weeks, and the fighting had been close and sustained and terrible. She cleaned the armor in silence. She worked slowly, deliberately, giving each piece the attention it required, and then more, because tonight the blood was not just blood. Tonight it was 14 people who had been alive that morning and were now in the field behind the eastern tree line with no markers and no ceremony beyond the king's words. And the blood on this armor was the evidence that one man had stood in the middle of all that dying and kept fighting. She was working the gorget, the stiff leather collar that protected the throat when the tent flap moved again. She did not stop. She had learned from the first time that stopping drew more attention than continuing. She kept her hands moving over the gorget, her brush working the blood from the leather in slow, measured strokes. He sat down, not close, not far. He lowered himself onto the camp stool outside the tent flap, 5 paces from where she knelt, and he sat with his forearms on his thighs and his hands hanging between his knees and his head slightly bowed. He was still in his underarmor, the padded leather and wool that went beneath the plate, and she could see the dark stain across his left shoulder where the old scar had opened or been opened, blood seeping through the padding. Dara looked at the stain. Her hands stopped on the gorget. He needed a healer. The shoulder was bleeding. Someone should look at it, should clean it and assess the damage and stitch it if stitching was needed. Someone should tell him to go to the healer's tent where Oren was already working through the night's casualties, and someone should make him sit still while the wound was tended. Dara was not someone. Dara was a camp follower who cleaned armor she had not been asked to clean. She had no authority and no standing and no right to speak to the king about his shoulder or anything else. She looked at the blood seeping through his padding. She looked at her own hands, cracked and salved and holding a scrub brush and a gorget. She finished the gorget. She set it with the other clean pieces. She stood. She carried her bucket to the water barrel and filled it with clean water, cold and clear. She tore a clean rag from her supply. She walked back to where the king sat with his head bowed and his shoulder bleeding. She set the bucket down beside the camp stool. She held out the clean rag. Alaric lifted his head. In the low firelight, his eyes were exactly as dark as she had imagined from the armor, and exactly as warm. He looked at the rag. He looked at her hands, the cracked knuckles and raw fingertips that told their own story. He looked at her face. Dara held the rag steady. She did not speak. She did not need to. The rag said what needed saying. Your shoulder is bleeding. This is clean. Let me help, or help yourself, but do not sit here and bleed. He took the rag. His fingers brushed hers in the exchange. The touch was brief and accidental and unremarkable, and Dara felt it in every cracked knuckle and raw fingertip and aching joint in both hands. She turned. She walked back to the armor. She knelt. She resumed cleaning. Behind her, she heard the quiet sounds of a man pressing a clean rag to his own shoulder, alone, in the dark, while a woman he had never spoken to cleaned the blood from his armor 5 paces away. Captain Rev Cathane noticed things. It was the quality that made her exceptional at her work and occasionally unbearable as a person, because she noticed things that people preferred to keep unnoticed, and she had the particular stubbornness of a woman who, having noticed, could not simply look away. She had noticed the Omega 3 weeks ago. Noticed her the way you notice a shift in the weather, not the event itself, but the evidence of it. The king's armor, which had been deteriorating since the armorsmith's death, was suddenly clean every morning. Not just wiped down. Clean. The kind of clean that spoke of time and attention and skill, the leather oiled, the buckles polished, the rivets checked. Someone was maintaining the king's armor with a healer's precision, and that someone was a quiet woman with a heavy braid and ruined hands who appeared at the command tent every night after the fires burned low and knelt in the mud and worked until the work was done. Revka had watched from a distance the first time, thinking it was a camp follower angling for favor or position. Omegas in war camps learned quickly that proximity to power was its own form of armor, and cleaning a king's plate was the kind of service that could translate into protection. But the woman did not look up. She did not glance toward the tent to see if she was being watched. She did not position herself where she might be noticed by the sentries, or the officers, or anyone who could reward her attention. She simply cleaned. And when she was done, she left, carrying her bucket and her brush, and walked back to the followers section without once looking over her shoulder. That was not angling. That was something else. Revka had made quiet inquiries. The woman was Dara Wynne, Aldenmere refugee, age 25, assigned to laundry and general labor, unremarkable in every way that the camp's records could measure. No pack affiliation, no bond, no disciplinary notes, no commendations. She occupied the space that the army created for people it needed, but did not value, the space between useful and invisible. Revka filed the information and kept watching. By the 14th night, which was 2 nights after the northern line broke and the casualties climbed to numbers that kept Revka awake and pacing, she had watched Dara repair a strap, tend the armor with increasing familiarity, and hand the king a clean rag for his bleeding shoulder without speaking a word. And she had watched Alaric let her. That was the detail that shifted everything. Not the woman's behavior, which was consistent and could be explained by habit or compulsion or grief or any number of things that drove people to repetitive acts of care. The king's behavior. He had watched her work and said nothing. He had sat down beside her and said nothing. He had accepted a rag from her hand and said nothing. He had not sent her away. He had not assigned someone else to the task. He had not questioned or interfered or even acknowledged the arrangement in any way that Revka could detect. Alaric Dane did not permit things by accident. In 9 years of war and 7 years of serving at his side, Revka had never known him to overlook a detail in his own camp. If the Omega was still cleaning his armor after 14 nights, it was because the king had decided to allow it. And if the king had decided to allow it, then Revka needed to understand why, because understanding Alaric's decisions before they became problems was the single most important function of her rank. She went to the supply stores the following morning and arranged for a standing requisition of lye soap, tallow, clean rags, and leather oil to be placed at the wash station where Dara worked. She did not leave a note. She did not attach a name. She simply ensured that the materials appeared, because whatever was happening between the Omega and the king's armor was happening under Revka's watch, and if it was going to continue, it would continue with proper supplies. That afternoon, she found Alaric at the map table in the command tent, studying the Northern Ridge deployment with the focused intensity that meant he was solving a problem in his head that he had not yet shared with anyone else. She stood across the table and waited. He did not look up for a full minute, which was not rudeness, but simply the way he worked, finishing one thought completely before beginning another. When he raised his head, she saw the fatigue. Not the surface kind, not the tiredness of a body that needed sleep, though he needed that too. The deeper kind, the kind that lived in the muscles around the eyes and in the set of the jaw and in the slight forward curve of the shoulders that appeared only when he thought no one was watching. He had been carrying this war for 9 years. He had been burying soldiers for 9 years. He had been fighting and winning and fighting and winning, and each win cost something that the next win could not replace, and the cost was accumulating in his bones the way salt accumulated in mine walls, invisible until the weight became structural. She told him that the northern line needed reinforcement before the next push. She told him that the supply route from the south was taking damage from raider parties and would need a dedicated escort. She told him that Lord Haddon was complaining about an Omega who frequented the command tent area at night, and that she had told Haddon to direct his complaints to her rather than to the king. Alaric's expression did not change at the mention of Haddon's complaint. That told Revka everything she needed to know about whether the king was aware of the Omega, because Alaric's face was a fortress when he did not want information to pass through it, and the fortress had just engaged. She did not press. She did not ask who the woman was, or why the king permitted her presence, or what it meant. She had served Alaric Dane long enough to know that pressing him on personal matters produced nothing but silence and a slight narrowing of his eyes that meant the subject was closed. Instead, she presented the tactical information, received his orders, and left the tent. At the entrance, she paused. She told him the supply requisition for the wash station had been filed. She told him she had ensured the woman had what she needed. She did not look back to see his reaction. She did not need to. The slight pause in his breathing, the half-second of stillness that preceded his quiet acknowledgement, told her that the fortress had a crack in it, and something behind the walls was paying attention. 3 nights later, the campaign shifted. The enemy pushed through the eastern flank with a force that the scouts had failed to predict. The battle was sudden and close, and fought in the dark, which was the worst kind of fighting because the dark turned every shape into a threat and every sound into ambush. Dara was in the followers section when the alarm horns blew, and she joined the other camp followers in the controlled chaos of preparation that civilians learned in war camps, the particular drill of dousing unnecessary fires, gathering the wounded supplies, and moving to the designated shelter positions behind the supply wagons. The fighting lasted 3 hours. Dara heard it the way everyone in camp heard it, as a distant roar punctuated by metal and screaming that came closer and then receded, and then came closer again, like a tide made of violence. She sat behind the wagons with her canvas roll in her lap and her folding knife in her hand and her back against a wheel spoke. And she waited the way she had learned to wait in Aldenmuir when the border raids came, by breathing slowly and counting the intervals between the sounds and judging from the rhythm whether the line was holding. When the horns blew the all clear at the 4th hour, Dara stood and walked to the healer's tent. Oren was already overwhelmed. The tent held 20 cots, and every cot was full, and a line of walking wounded stretched out the entrance into the pre-dawn gray. Oren moved between patients with his shaking hands steady on the tools. His assistant, a young beta woman, stitching a soldier's arm with the grim concentration of someone who had learned surgery by necessity rather than training. Dara walked in. She did not ask permission. She found the supply shelf, took clean rags and a basin of boiled water, and moved to the nearest unattended patient, a soldier with a deep cut across his forearm that was bleeding freely and needed pressure before it needed stitches. She pressed the cloth to the wound. She applied pressure with the heel of her hand, firm and steady, the way her mother had taught her. The soldier looked at her with the wild, unfocused eyes of someone in shock and said something she did not register. She told him to hold still. She told him the bleeding would slow if he held still. She used the calm, level voice that Enid Wynne had used on every patient, the voice that said, "I am here, and I know what I am doing, and you are going to be fine," regardless of whether any of those things were true. Oren saw her. His eyes moved from her hands on the wound to her face to her hands again, and he nodded once, a single sharp inclination of his chin that meant he recognized what she was doing and that she should continue doing it. Dara worked through the night. She cleaned wounds and applied pressure and stitched the ones that Oren pointed her toward when his hands were full and the line was growing. Her stitches were neat and even, the product of years of practice on everything from human skin to leather to canvas. She worked without stopping, without eating, without acknowledging the fatigue that crept up her arms and into her shoulders and settled behind her eyes like a weight. By dawn, the worst of the wounded were stabilized. The dead had been carried to the field. The living were bandaged and stitched and sleeping the shallow, exhausted sleep of people who had been cut open and put back together by hands that knew the difference between the two. Oren found her at the wash basin. She was cleaning blood from her hands, and the motion was so familiar, so identical to the motion she made every night over the king's armor, that the parallel struck her like a physical blow. Blood on the outside, clean the blood, find what is beneath, armor and skin, iron and flesh, the king's violence and these soldiers' wounds. She was cleaning the same thing. She had always been cleaning the same thing. Oren stood beside her. He did not speak for a long moment. Then he said that her mother had taught her well. He said that the sutures on the young soldier's forearm were better than his assistant's, and nearly as good as his own. He said that if she wanted to work in the healer's tent, the position was hers. Dara looked at her hands in the basin. The water was pink. The water was always pink. She said she would think about it, but her hands were already answering for her, the way they always did, because her hands had never stopped being a healer's hands, even when the rest of her had forgotten what that meant. That night, she went to the command tent. The armor was there. The blood was thick. She cleaned it. She cleaned it with the same hands that had stitched soldiers and pressed wounds and washed blood from skin. And the act was not different. It had never been different. She had been healing him the only way she could, through the iron skin he wore into the world, tending the violence he carried the same way she tended the violence that came into the healer's tent, by removing what did not belong and caring for what remained. She was working the left pauldron, checking her canvas repair from the previous week, when the tent flap opened and the king sat down on the camp stool. He was injured. She could see it in the way he moved, the careful placement of his weight, the slight hitch as he lowered himself. Not the shoulder this time, his right side, below the ribs. A wrap of bandage showed at the edge of his tunic, white gone pink with seepage. Dara cleaned the pauldron. She did not look at the bandage. She did not offer a rag. Alaric watched her work. The silence between them had become its own language, a conversation conducted in the sounds of scrubbing and water and the occasional clink of metal on stone. Tonight the silence carried more weight. Tonight it carried the weight of 14 new dead and the king's bleeding side, and Dara's healer's hands that wanted to reach for the bandage the way they reached for armor, automatically, without permission, because damage was damage and her hands did not distinguish. After a long while, the king spoke. His voice was lower than she had expected. rougher, the voice of a man who had been shouting orders in battle and had not yet recovered the register he used for everything else. He said one word. He said her name. Dara. She stopped. The brush hovered over the vambrace. She looked up. He was looking at her hands, not her face. Her hands, the cracked knuckles and raw fingertips and the faint pink staining of the salve that Oren kept replacing. He was looking at her hands the way she looked at his armor, reading the damage, assessing what lay beneath. He said he had been told she worked in the healer's tent tonight. He said Oren had told him, not as gossip, but as information, the way a healer reports a resource. He said the word Oren had used was instinct, that she had walked in and her hands had known what to do before the rest of her had decided. Dara held the brush. She held it so tightly that the bristles pressed into her palm and left marks that would outlast the conversation. She told him that her mother was a healer. The words came out in the flat, stripped tone of someone who had not spoken about her mother in 2 years and was not prepared for the way the words would feel in her mouth. Her mother was a field healer. She had been training to follow her mother's practice. Then the border raid came, and her mother died, and her training became a collection of skills that no one in a war camp asked an Omega to use. The king listened. His dark eyes did not move from her hands. He asked why she cleaned his armor. Dara looked at the vambrace in her lap. She looked at the blood she had been removing. She looked at her own hands, raw and capable and aching with purpose. She told him the truth because the truth was all she had, and because he had asked, and because she was tired of carrying an answer that no one had requested until now. She cleaned his armor because blood on the outside meant harm on the inside, and her hands could not see blood on a surface without needing to remove it, because cleaning was healing and his armor was the closest thing to a patient she had been allowed to touch in 2 years. Because the act of caring for something damaged was the only act that still made her feel like the person she had been before the raid, the person her mother had been training her to become. Because his armor held the shape of him, and tending it was the closest she could come to tending him without crossing a line that would end the only purpose she had found in this camp. The silence after she finished was the longest silence they had shared. It lasted through the dying of the nearest fire and the changing of the sentry and the slow wheel of stars above the command tent. Then the king said something that Dara would carry for the rest of her life. He said that he had never asked her to stop because stopping would have taken away the only thing in this camp that made him feel like the violence had not won the day. After the conversation, things changed. Not dramatically, not in the way of stories where a single exchange remakes the world overnight. They changed the way weather changes in the north, in increments so small that you only noticed the shift when you looked back and realized you were standing in a different season. Dara continued to clean the armor every night, but now when the king sat on the camp stool outside his tent, which he did most nights, the silence between them had a different quality. It was not the silence of two strangers occupying the same space without acknowledgement. It was the silence of two people who had said the essential thing and found that the space after the essential thing was more comfortable than the space before it. He did not ask her questions. She did not volunteer information. They existed in the nightly ritual the way a current exists in a river, present and directional and quiet beneath the surface. She cleaned. He sat. The camp slept around them in the particular exhausted sleep of a war that had gone on long enough to become the only life anyone remembered. Dara began working in the healer's tent during the days. Oren did not assign her formally. There was no paperwork, no change in her camp designation, no adjustment to her ration or her sleeping assignment. What happened was simpler and more honest than any formal appointment could be. Oren left her a clean apron on the supply shelf. She put it on. She walked into the tent. She started working. After 3 days, the soldiers who came in with wounds began asking for her by name, and the young assistant began deferring to her on suture technique, and the tent's daily rhythm incorporated her presence the way a body incorporates a graft, not by decision, but by the recognition that what was being added had always been needed. Her hands remembered everything, the angles of entry for stitches that minimized scarring, the pressure points that slowed bleeding without requiring a tourniquet, the way to splint a fractured finger so that the bone set true, the way to clean a wound, starting from the edges and working inward, never pushing debris deeper, always drawing the damage out. Her mother's teachings surfaced through her hands like water through stone, slow and persistent and impossible to stop once the channel was opened. She worked through the mornings on the routine cases, blistered feet, infected cuts left too long without attention, the particular repetitive strains of soldiers who spent their days in armor, the shoulder problems and the knee problems, and the lower back compression that came from carrying 60 pounds of iron and leather and weapon across broken terrain. She checked her work twice. She cleaned her instruments after every patient. She kept the same meticulous attention to the soldiers' bodies that she kept to the king's armor because the principle was the same. Blood on the outside means harm on the inside. Clean the blood, find the wound, tend what remains. In the afternoons, when the patrols returned and the combat wounded came in, she assisted Orrin directly. She learned his methods, which differed from her mother's in technique, but not in philosophy. Orrin worked faster than Enid had, his movements economical and precise, honed by decades of field surgery where speed was the difference between a soldier who kept his arm and a soldier who lost it. Dara adapted. She matched his pace. She anticipated his needs, passing instruments and materials before he asked, reading the rhythm of his work the way she read the rhythm of battle through the king's armor. On the 5th day of her work in the healer's tent, young Thomas limped in with his bad leg weeping through its bandage. The wound from the Grey March crossing had opened again, the stitches pulling free where the scar tissue was thin and the underlying muscle had never properly healed. Orrin was occupied with a spear wound. His assistant was occupied with a dislocated shoulder. Dara was the one who unwrapped the bandage, cleaned the wound, and assessed the damage. The original stitches had been adequate, but not optimal. The wound had healed on the surface, but remained compromised beneath, a pocket of inflammation that reopened under stress. Dara knew this kind of wound. Her mother had called them half-healed, wounds that had closed but not resolved, the body's attempt to move forward without addressing what was actually wrong. She told Thomas she would need to open the wound properly before she could close it properly. She told him it would hurt. She told him he could hold onto the cot frame if he needed to, and that she would work as quickly as she could. Tomas looked at her with wide, earnest eyes that were too young for the war they had been watching for 8 months. He asked if she was a real healer or a laundry worker. The question held no malice. He was 19 and frightened and wanted to know if the hands about to reopen his leg belonged to someone who knew what she was doing. Dara told him she was both. She told him her mother had been a healer and that before the war she had been training to follow the same path, and that for the past 2 years she had been washing laundry and armor because no one had asked her to do anything else. She told him that her hands were a healer's hands, whether anyone recognized it or not, and that his leg would be fine. Thomas gripped the cot frame. Dara opened the wound, cleaned the inflammation, debrided the half-healed tissue, and restitched the muscle layer with the deep, reinforcing sutures her mother had taught her, the kind that held from beneath rather than from the surface. She closed the skin with neat, even stitches, applied a clean dressing, and wrapped the leg with a compression bandage. The entire procedure took 12 minutes. When she finished, Thomas released the cot frame. His knuckles were white from gripping. He looked at his leg and then at her face, and something in his expression shifted from the wariness of a soldier assessing a stranger to something simpler and warmer. He thanked her, not the perfunctory thanks of a soldier moving through a medical tent, but the real, quiet thanks of someone who had been afraid and was no longer afraid, because someone had been competent and kind at the same time, which was rarer than either quality alone. Dara cleaned her instruments. She washed the blood from her hands. She moved to the next patient. Word moved through the camp, the way everything moved through camps, slowly and then all at once. The Omega who washed laundry was a healer. The Omega who cleaned the king's armor had trained hands. The Omega who had been invisible for 2 years was suddenly visible, and the visibility changed things in ways Dara had not anticipated and could not control. Lord Haddonmarsh was the first problem. He appeared at the healer's tent on the 7th day, not as a patient but as an administrator. He stood in the entrance with his polished boots and his fine wool and his pale blue eyes that assessed everything in terms of order and irregularity, and he informed Orrin that the camp's medical staff was a matter of record, that all personnel changes required quartermaster approval, and that the Omega working in the tent had not been reassigned through proper channels. Orrin looked at Haddon with the flat, unimpressed expression of a man who had been healing soldiers since before Haddon had learned to hold a ledger. He told Haddon that when Lord Haddon could stitch a perforated bowel in the dark while an enemy attack was underway, he would welcome Haddon's input on staffing decisions. Until that day, Orrin would staff his tent with whoever could do the work, and the Omega could do the work. Haddon's jaw tightened. He did not argue with Orrin, because arguing with the camp's only experienced healer during an active campaign was the kind of decision that got a supply officer removed from his post. Instead, he noted the irregularity in his ledger and left. But Dara had seen his face as he turned, and she recognized the expression. She had seen it in Aldenmere on the faces of the pack leaders who had decided that an Omega without family was a resource to be cataloged rather than a person to be considered. Haddon did not see her as a healer or a woman or a threat. He saw her as a line item that did not balance, and men like Haddon could not rest until every line item balanced. The second change was subtler and took longer to manifest. The soldiers began treating her differently. Not all of them, and not dramatically, but enough for Dara to notice. The ones she had treated came to the wash station or the laundry line and spoke to her. Not about anything important. About the weather, about the rations, about the small complaints that soldiers carried like pocket stones, worn smooth from handling. They spoke to her because she had touched their wounds, and the touch had created a connection that the army's hierarchy did not account for and could not sever. You could not remain invisible to someone whose bleeding you had stopped. Thomas was the most persistent. He found reasons to be wherever she was, not in the trailing, desperate way of someone seeking attachment, but in the simple, direct way of a 19-year-old who had found someone in the camp who made him feel less alone and did not want to lose the feeling. He talked to her about his family's farm in the southern lowlands. He talked about the goats he missed more than he missed the people, which he said with a grin that made him look even younger than he was. He talked about the war the way young soldiers talked about wars, with a mixture of terror and dark humor that was its own form of survival. He asked her once why she cleaned the king's armor. He asked it without judgment, with the genuine curiosity of someone who had noticed an unusual thing and wanted to understand it rather than categorize it. Dara told him what she had told the king, that her hands needed to clean blood, that the armor was a wound she could tend, that the ritual was the only thing that had kept her sane in 2 years of being invisible. Tomas was quiet for a long time after that. Then he asked if it helped, if the cleaning made the blood feel like it mattered less. Dara considered this. She told him that it did not make the blood matter less. It made the blood matter differently. It turned the blood from evidence of harm into evidence of care because someone had taken the time to remove it. Thomas nodded like he understood, and perhaps he did, in the way that 19-year-olds who have fought in 3 battles understand things that they should not yet have the experience to understand. The 19th night came. The camp had settled into an uneasy pause, the enemy withdrawing to regroup after 3 weeks of sustained engagement. No battle today, no skirmish, no patrol contact. The armor was outside the tent, but it was clean. He had not fought. The plate showed only the normal wear of a day in camp, dust and minor scuffing, the kind of maintenance that took 15 minutes rather than an hour. Dara cleaned it anyway. She cleaned it because the ritual had become necessary for its own sake, because the act of kneeling beside the command tent and working her hands over the iron was the anchor of her days, the point around which everything else arranged itself. She cleaned it because stopping would mean something, and she was not ready for whatever that meaning was. The tent flap opened. He sat. The stool creaked under his weight. Tonight the silence was different again, lighter. The absence of battle had removed the weight that usually pressed on the space between them, the weight of the day's dead and wounded and the blood that translated violence into something she could hold in her hands. Without that weight, the silence was just 2 people sitting in the dark, breathing the same cold air, existing in the same small circle of dying firelight. Alaric asked how Tomas's leg was healing. The question was ordinary, conversational, the kind of question a king asks a healer about a soldier in his command, the kind of question that has a simple answer and requires no emotional excavation. Dara told him the leg was healing well. The restitching had held. The inflammation was resolving. He would walk without a limp within the month. Alaric made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been relief. Then he told her that Oren had requested her permanent assignment to the healer's tent. He told her he had approved it. He told her that her designation had been changed from camp laborer to field healer's apprentice, effective that morning with the corresponding change in rations and quarters and standing. Dara's hand stopped on the pauldron. She looked up. In the dim light, the king's face was shadows and plains, the heavy jaw and broad nose and dark eyes that had become as familiar as the armor she held. He was not looking at her hands tonight. He was looking at her face, and the expression in his eyes was not the unreadable fortress that Revka had described. It was something simpler and more devastating. It was the look of a man who had found something worth protecting in a place where everything was designed to be destroyed. She asked if Haddon had objected. The question came out dry and practical, and entirely unlike the feeling that was rising in her chest like a tide. Alaric's mouth moved. Not a smile, not quite. Something that lived in the space where smiles would go if he remembered how to make them. He told her that Haddon had noted the irregularity and that he, the king, had told Haddon that the irregularity would remain and that further notes on the subject were unnecessary. Dara looked at the pauldron. She looked at her hands. She looked at the king. She told him she would still clean his armor. She told him the healing was not a replacement for the cleaning. They were the same work done on different surfaces, the same hands doing the same thing, and she would not give up one because the other had been recognized. Alaric watched her. The almost smile faded into something more serious, more present. He told her he had never intended for her to stop. Dara nodded. She lowered her eyes to the pauldron. She resumed cleaning. The king sat on his stool and watched her work, and the silence between them settled back into its familiar shape. But warmer now, and closer to something that neither of them had named, but that both of them were tending with the same patience and care that Dara brought to blood on iron. The final push came without warning, on a morning that began like any other. Dara was in the healer's tent rewrapping a soldier's infected hand when the alarm horns blew. 2 long blasts followed by 3 short ones, the signal for a full assault on the camp's perimeter rather than a distant engagement. She tied off the bandage, told the soldier to keep his hand elevated, and moved to the tent's entrance. The camp was transforming. Soldiers emerged from tents already half-armored, muscle memory carrying them through the motions of preparation while their minds caught up to the horns. Officers shouted orders along the central lane. The farrier's boy sprinted past leading 2 war horses by their bridles, and behind the supply wagons, the camp followers were already implementing the drill, dousing fires, gathering the medical supplies into the canvas sacks that could be carried if the camp had to be abandoned. Dara watched Alaric cross the central lane at a run. He was in his underarmor, the padded leather and wool, and Captain Revka was beside him, already shouting deployment orders over her shoulder at the squad leaders converging behind them. Alaric's body moved differently when combat was imminent. The restriction in his left shoulder disappeared, overridden by whatever internal mechanism transformed caution into necessity. He was fluid and fast and absolutely focused, and for 3 seconds Dara forgot the tent and the patience and the horns, and simply watched the way his body became an instrument of response. Then the first clash of steel reached the camp from the eastern tree line, and Dara turned back to the healer's tent and began preparing for what was coming. She worked alongside Oren for the next 6 hours. The casualties arrived in waves, carried on stretchers, and dragged between the arms of comrades and walking under their own power with the dazed, determined gait of people who were injured and knew it but would not stop moving until their bodies forced the decision. Dara's world narrowed to the immediate circle of her work. Clean the wound, assess the damage, stitch what could be stitched, splint what could be splinted, apply pressure, apply bandages, apply the calm, steady voice that told each soldier they were going to be fine. She lost count of the patients. The tent filled and overflowed and filled again as the stabilized were moved to the recovery area, and new wounded replaced them on the cots. The floor was slick with blood. The air smelled of iron and sweat and the sharp green of the poultices she applied to open wounds to prevent infection. Her apron was soaked through. Her hands, raw despite the salve, were steady. At the 4th hour, Thomas was carried in. 2 soldiers had him between them, his arms across their shoulders, his right leg dragging. The wound had opened again, worse this time, torn through the repair she had made. Blood ran freely down his calf and pooled in his boot. His face was gray with pain and blood loss, but his eyes were open and focused, and he managed a grin when he saw her. He told her that he had been saving this for her, that his leg apparently preferred her stitching to combat. The joke cost him. She could see the effort it took to push words through the pain, and the effort told her more about his condition than the wound itself. When soldiers joked, they were frightened. When soldiers joked well, they were terrified. Dara did not smile. She moved him to a cot, cut away the bandage, and assessed the damage. The muscle tear was deeper this time, extending into tissue that had not been compromised before. The blood was arterial, bright red, and pulsing, which meant a vessel had been nicked. She applied pressure with both hands and called for Oren. Oren was elbow deep in a chest wound 3 cots away. He glanced over, saw the bright red, and told her to clamp the vessel and stitch it herself. He told her she could do it. He said it with the flat certainty of a man who did not offer reassurance unless it was warranted. Dara clamped the vessel. Her fingers worked by feel, locating the source of the bleed beneath the torn muscle, isolating it, applying the clamp with steady pressure. Thomas made a sound that was not a word, and his hand found her arm and gripped it hard enough that she felt his fingers through her rolled sleeve. She told him to breathe. She told him the worst part was done. She told him about the goats on his family's farm, because he had told her about them 3 times, and the details were lodged in her memory the way all patient details lodged there, permanently and without effort. She told him that the brown goat, the one he called General, would not recognize him when he got home, because he was taller now and smelled different, and that the goat would probably headbutt him out of confusion, and that he should be prepared for this. Thomas laughed. It was thin and breathless and accompanied by a tear that ran sideways across his temple, but it was a laugh, and it carried him through the minutes while Dara sutured the vessel and closed the muscle layer and stitched the skin. When she finished, his grip on her arm loosened. His eyes were heavy. She told him to sleep. She told him the leg would hold this time because she had stitched it 3 layers deep, and it would take more than one battle to undo 3 layers of her mother's technique. He was asleep before she finished the sentence. Dara pulled a blanket over him and moved to the next patient. The battle ended at the 6th hour. The enemy broke and retreated east, and the camp's defensive line held, and the horns blew the all clear, and the quiet that followed was the particular heavy silence of a place where violence had exhausted itself and left nothing but its aftermath. Dara worked through the silence. She worked through the counting of the dead, which reached 21 before it was done. She worked through the evening meal that she did not eat. She worked through the dimming of the light and the rising of the stars, and the slow, gradual transition of the healer's tent from emergency chaos to exhausted stability. Oren touched her shoulder at dusk. She did not know how long he had been standing there. He told her to stop. He told her she had been working for 10 hours without rest, and that a healer who did not care for herself could not care for others. He told her it was the first thing every healer learned, and the last thing every healer obeyed. Dara looked at her hands. They were shaking. Not the subtle tremor of Oren's nerve damage, but the gross, visible shake of muscles that had been held in tension for too long and had reached the end of their capacity. She could not close her fingers fully. The shaking made her hands look like they belonged to someone else. She washed them. She washed the blood from between her fingers and from beneath her nails and from the creases of her knuckles where it had dried in dark lines. She applied the salve. She removed the apron and hung it on the hook by the tent entrance. She stepped outside into the evening air. The camp was dark and quiet. The fires along the central lane had been relit, low and steady, and the soldiers who were not on sentry duty or in the healer's tent had retired to their own tents to sleep or stare at canvas and process what the day had cost. Dara stood outside the healer's tent and breathed the cold air and felt the shaking in her hands migrate into the rest of her body until she was trembling from scalp to soul with the particular full-body tremor that comes when the emergency is over and the body finally acknowledges what it has been carrying. She walked to the command tent. She walked there because the ritual was the only anchor she had, and the anchor was the only thing that could hold her steady when everything else was shaking. The armor was not outside the tent. Dara stopped. The space where the armor usually sat, the flat patch of mud where she knelt every night with her bucket and brush, was empty. She looked at the emptiness and felt something shift inside her, a lurch of disorientation that was far too large for the absence of a pile of iron and leather and far too revealing about what the pile had come to mean. She stood in the dark and stared at the empty mud. The tent flap opened. Revka Thane stepped out. In the low firelight, the captain's face was drawn and pale, and there was something in her eyes that Dara had not seen before. Something that looked like concern, stripped of the professional distance that Revka maintained, the way Alaric maintained his silences. Revka told her the king was inside. She told her the king had taken a wound at the 3rd hour, a blade that slipped beneath the pauldron, the left pauldron, the one with the canvas strap that Dara had repaired. The blade had gone into the shoulder, into the old scar, into the tissue that was already compromised. Oren had stitched it during the fighting, but the shoulder was bad. The king had fought for 3 more hours with a stitched shoulder because the line was breaking and the king did not leave a breaking line, and the stitches had torn and the wound had opened and the shoulder was now worse than it had been in years. Revka told her the armor was inside the tent because she had carried it inside herself. She told her she had done this because she had seen the king, after the battle, after the stitches and the bleeding and the 6 hours of combat, try to carry the armor outside himself. And when she had asked why, he had said that someone would be looking for it. Dara felt the words settle into her, the way a blade settles into a wound, sharp and clean and cutting something that had been holding. Revka stepped aside. She held the tent flap open. She did not say anything more because Revka Thane was a woman who noticed things. And what she had noticed was that the king's armor had been tended by the same hands that now needed to tend the king himself, and the distance between those two acts was the distance between the tent flap and the man sitting inside it. Dara walked into the command tent. He was sitting on his field cot. The tent was lit by a single oil lamp that cast warm amber light across the dark canvas walls, and the map table and the camp stool and the stack of armor pieces that Revka had placed on the ground beside the cot. He was stripped to the waist. His torso was a landscape of scars, old ones and new ones, the deep dark brown of his skin crossed with silver and white lines that told the story of 9 years of war more honestly than any chronicle. The left shoulder was bandaged, the wrap bulky and already darkening with blood. He looked up when she entered. His eyes were heavy with exhaustion and pain, and for the first time since she had started cleaning his armor, the fortress was gone. The king's face was simply a man's face, open and weary and showing the particular vulnerability of someone in pain who has run out of the energy required to hide it. Dara crossed the tent. She stood before him. She looked at the shoulder. The bandage was inadequate. She could see that from where she stood. Oren's work had been done in the field, under combat conditions, with the quick efficiency of a healer who had 20 other patients waiting. The stitches would need reinforcement, the wound would need proper cleaning and assessment, and the kind of sustained, meticulous care that only came from hands with time and attention to spare. She asked if she could look at it. She asked it the way her mother had taught her to ask, directly and without apology. Because a healer who apologized for wanting to heal was a healer who had forgotten the purpose of her hands. The king held still while she unwrapped the bandage. He held still while she cleaned the wound, drawing out the debris that field stitching always left, working with the gentleness and precision that her mother's ghost guided through her fingers. The wound was deep. The blade had entered the old scar tissue and cut into the muscle beneath, and the muscle was angry and swollen and bled freely when disturbed. She stitched it. She stitched it with the same neat layered technique she had used on Thomas's leg, the deep reinforcing sutures beneath and the careful closing sutures above. She worked slowly because the shoulder was compromised and because the man attached to it was watching her hands with the same attention she gave his armor, and she would not rush under that attention. When she finished, she rewrapped the shoulder with clean bandages. She tied the wrap with the particular knot her mother had favored, the one that held under movement but released with a single pull. She stepped back. Alaric looked at his shoulder. He looked at the wrapping. He looked at her. He told her that her hands felt the same on his skin as they felt on his armor. He told her he recognized the touch. He told her he had been watching it for weeks through iron and leather, and that feeling it directly was exactly what he had imagined. Dara stood in the warm, amber lamplight with blood on her healer's hands and the king's eyes on her face, and felt the last wall between cleaning armor and tending the man inside. It dissolved like rust in lye water, quietly and completely, leaving nothing but the clean surface beneath. 7 days after the final battle, the treaty was signed in the command tent on the map table that had held campaign plans for 9 years. Dara was not present for the signing. She was in the healer's tent, changing the dressing on a soldier's chest wound, when the horns blew the particular 3-note sequence that meant the war was over. The soldier looked up at her with wide eyes. Dara looked down at the wound she was dressing and finished the bandage before she allowed herself to hear what the horns meant. The camp reacted the way any army reacts to the end of a war. It has been fighting long enough to forget what peace felt like. There was no celebration. There was a deep, pervasive exhale, a releasing of tension held so long that the muscles had forgotten what relaxation was. And in that exhale, there was relief and grief and exhaustion and the particular empty feeling of a purpose that has been completed and not yet replaced. Dara walked through the camp that afternoon and watched the soldiers begin the process of dismantling the lives they had built around violence. Armor was stacked. Weapons were cleaned and stored. The supply wagons began their transformation from mobile infrastructure to transport vehicles, their contents shifting from the tools of war to the materials of return. The farrier's boy led the horses to the stream and let them stand in the water and drink without urgency for the first time in months. Lord Haddon was everywhere, his ledger in hand, his pale blue eyes cataloging and counting and converting the machinery of war into the machinery of logistics. He passed Dara twice without acknowledging her, which suited them both. The irregularity of her existence no longer required his attention. She was in the records now. Field healer's apprentice, a line item that balanced. Thomas found her at the wash station. He was walking without the crutch for the first time, moving gingerly but steadily, the repaired leg bearing weight with the careful determination of bone and muscle that had been told to heal and was obeying. He sat on the upturned bucket beside her and told her he was going home. His conscription would be dissolved with the treaty. His family's farm was 4 days' walk south, and he intended to start walking as soon as his leg allowed. He asked what she would do. Dara looked at her hands. They were still raw, still reddened, still bearing the permanent marks of 2 years of lye soap and cold water. But the cracks had closed. The salve had done its work. The skin between her fingers was smooth for the first time in months, the rawness fading into toughness, the damage becoming not damage but adaptation. She told him she did not know. It was the truth, and the truth sat between them with the same weight that the silence had carried between her and the king for weeks. She did not know what happened next. The war had provided structure, had given her a place and a function and a nightly ritual that oriented her days. Without the war, the armor would not need cleaning. Without the battle, the blood would stop. Without the blood, what was she? A healer without a practice, a woman without a pack, an omega whose purpose had been defined by a man's violence and her response to it. Thomas was quiet for a long time. Then he told her something that surprised her, because it was more perceptive than she expected from a 19-year-old farm boy who talked about goats. He told her that she was not the bucket, she was not the brush, she was not the armor or the blood or the lye water, she was the hands, and hands could do many things. He left the wash station with his careful, healing walk. Dara watched him go and felt something in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite hope, but lived in the territory between them where transitions happened. That evening, for the first time in 36 nights, there was no blood on the armor. Dara found the plates stacked outside the command tent, as always, positioned in the assembly order she had established weeks ago. But the surfaces were clean. There was no blood, no mud, no scuffing from combat. The armor was as she had left it the previous night, untouched by violence, carrying only the dust of a day spent in a camp that was no longer at war. She knelt beside it anyway. She dipped her brush in the bucket and she cleaned it. She cleaned the dust from the joints and the fingerprints from the metal and the invisible traces of a day's wearing. She oiled the leather. She checked the buckles. She inspected her canvas strap repair, which had held through every battle and skirmish and patrol since the night she had made it, and found it still solid. The tent flap opened. He sat down. The stool creaked. The silence between them was new again. Not the silence of strangers. Not the silence of people who had spoken the essential thing. Not the silence weighted with the day's dead. This was the silence of an ending, and endings had a sound that was different from everything that came before them. A hollowness at the center where the routine used to live. Alaric told her the army would begin its march south in 3 days. He told her the wounded who could travel would move with the column, and the ones who could not would remain in camp under Oren's care until they were able. He told her that Oren had requested that she remain with the medical contingent. He told her these things in his low, rough voice, the voice she had heard speak her name once and carry the weight of 21 dead on another night and say, on the night that mattered most, that her cleaning had been the only thing in this camp that made him feel like the violence had not won the day. Dara set down the brush. She told him she would go where she was needed. She told him it was what her mother had taught her. A healer goes where the wounds are. Alaric looked at her. The lamplight from inside the tent caught the silver at his temples and turned it pale gold. His left arm rested carefully at his side, the shoulder still wrapped, still healing under the bandages she changed every morning with the same attention she had given to his armor. He told her the wounds were not all in the camp. The words arrived simply, without decoration, without the weight of rank or the armor of silences he usually wore around anything personal. He said it the way a patient finally says the thing they have been avoiding, the confession that makes the diagnosis possible. He told her that the shoulder was old, that it had been given to him at 12 by someone who should have protected him, and that it had never properly healed because he had never let anyone close enough to tend it. He told her that for 9 years he had put on the armor every morning and taken off the armor every night, and the time between was combat. and the time after was emptiness, and the emptiness had become so familiar that he had mistaken it for strength. He told her that the first night he had watched her clean his armor, he had not understood what he was seeing. By the fifth night he had understood, and the understanding had frightened him because it meant the emptiness was not strength. It was a wound, and she was cleaning it the same way she cleaned everything, by removing what did not belong and caring for what remained. Dara listened. Her hands were still. The brush lay in her lap. The armor was clean, and the night was quiet, and the war was over, and the man who had worn the iron was sitting 5 paces from her and telling her that she had been healing him from the beginning. She asked about the shoulder. Not the battlefield shoulder, not the wound from the final push that she had stitched and dressed and tended. The other shoulder, the original wound, the one that had been given to him at 12. Alaric was quiet for a long time. He told her in the careful, measured language of someone who has carried a thing for 21 years and is setting it down for the first time. Not because the weight has become unbearable, but because someone is finally standing close enough to help hold it. He told her about the man who had given him the wound and what the giving had cost and what the scar had meant every day since. Dara did not speak while he told her. She did not offer comfort or reassurance or the kind of well-meaning words that people offered when they heard difficult things and wanted to fill the silence with something softer than the truth. She sat with her hands in her lap and her brush beside her, and she listened the way her mother had taught her to listen to a patient, with her whole body, receiving the information without flinching, assessing the wound without judgment. When he finished, the silence that followed was clean. Not heavy, not hollow, not weighted with the things unsaid. Clean. Like armor after the blood has been removed. Like a wound after the debris has been drawn out. Like the space that opens up when something old and harmful is finally exposed to air and light and the steady attention of hands that know what healing requires. Dara stood. She crossed the 5 paces between them. She knelt beside the camp stool. She placed her hands, her raw, healer's, armor-cleaning hands on his left shoulder, over the bandage, over the wound, over the scar beneath the wound that had been there since he was 12 years old. She held them there. She did not press. She did not probe. She simply placed her hands where they had wanted to be since the first night she had cleaned his armor, on the place where the damage was deepest and oldest and most in need of care. Alaric closed his eyes. They stayed like that while the camp settled into its first truly quiet night in 9 years. No sentries called alarm, no horns broke the darkness, no soldiers screamed in their sleep from dreams of the battles that would follow them home. The fires burned low, and the stars turned overhead, and the war was over, and the woman who had cleaned the blood knelt beside the man who had carried it and put her hands where the hurt began. In the morning, Dara packed her canvas roll. She packed the brush and the rags and the folding knife. That was the only possession she had carried out of Aldenmere. She packed the jar of salve, half empty, that Oren continued to replace and that she would continue to need, because her hands would always be a healer's hands, and healer's hands always paid a cost. She did not pack the bucket. The bucket belonged to the wash station. It belonged to the war. She went to the healer's tent and told Oren she would not be staying with the medical contingent. Oren looked at her with his shrewd, shaking-handed calm and told her he had expected as much. He told her she was a better healer than she knew, and that her mother, wherever Enid Wynne had gone, would be satisfied with what her daughter's hands had learned to do. He gave her a leather roll of surgical instruments, her own. He told her he had been keeping it aside for 2 weeks, waiting for her to decide where she was going before he decided where the instruments should go. Dara held the roll. The weight of it in her hands was the weight of a future she had not allowed herself to imagine, solid and real and shaped by someone else's belief in what she could become. She found Thomas at the eastern edge of camp, stretching his healing leg for the walk south. She told him to keep the wound clean and to change the dressing daily and to find a healer in his village who could remove the sutures in 10 days. She told him about General the Goat and how he should brace for impact. Thomas grinned. He told her she was the best healer he had ever met and that when his leg carried him home, every step would be on her stitching. She did not watch him walk away. She had learned from the war that watching people leave was the least useful form of attention. The army formed its marching column at midday. Dara walked to the command tent for the last time. The armor was stacked outside, clean, assembled, waiting. She looked at it. She looked at the left pauldron, with her canvas strap repair. She looked at the breastplate with its gouge mark, and the vambraces with their scratches, and the gorget that she had cleaned blood from more times than she could count. She knew this armor the way a healer knew a patient's body, intimately and completely, and with the particular attachment that came from sustained care. She did not clean it. There was nothing to clean. The armor was already spotless, tended, maintained. It was ready. Alaric emerged from the tent. He was dressed for the march, the dark wool and campaign leather, and the long coat that she had never cleaned because the coat was not armor, and she had drawn the line there, at iron and leather, at the things designed to protect him from the outside. The inside had been someone else's province, and then, on the night he told her about the shoulder, it had become hers. He looked at the armor, he looked at her, he looked at her hands. He asked her to ride south with the column. He did not frame it as an order or a request or an offer. He framed it as a question, simple and direct, the way a man asks a question when the answer matters more than anything he has asked in a long time. Dara looked at the camp, the empty tents being struck, the fire pits going cold, the wash station where she had scrubbed blood from iron for 36 nights, where Oren had left her salve, where Revka had arranged supplies without a word, where she had rebuilt herself one night at a time from the ruins of a village called Aldenmere. She told him yes, she told him she would ride south with the column. She told him she would bring her brush and her instruments and her hands that did not know how to stop caring for things that bled. She told him she would still clean his armor. Alaric's face did something she had never seen it do. It opened. The fortress came down, not in stages, but all at once, the way a wall falls when the mortar has been dissolving for weeks and the final stone gives way. He smiled. It transformed his face the way she had always suspected it would, turning the heavy jaw and the broad nose and the dark, serious eyes into something warm and startled and entirely human. He told her he was counting on it. The column moved south at the second hour of the afternoon. Dara rode beside the medical wagon, her canvas roll at her hip, her brush in her pack, Oren's surgical instruments across her back. Behind her, the war camp diminished into the northern landscape until it was nothing but a smudge of disturbed earth and cold fire pits and the memory of 36 nights kneeling in the mud beside a command tent, cleaning blood from iron. Ahead, the road stretched through pine forest and river crossings and the long descending miles of a kingdom that was waiting for its king to come home. The armor was packed in the supply wagon, clean and oiled and ready for whatever came next. Dara's hands rested in her lap as the horse walked. They were raw and reddened and strong, and they did not shake. Blood has a smell that changes with time. Dara knew this the way most people knew the smell of bread or wood smoke, but she also knew something else now, something her mother had never taught her because it was the kind of thing that could not be taught, only learned by 36 nights of scrubbing iron in the dark beside a man who never asked her to stop. She knew that the act of removing blood was an act of faith. Faith that the surface beneath was worth revealing. Faith that the damage could be undone, or if not undone, then tended. Faith that the hands that did the work were changed by the work as surely as the iron was changed by the cleaning. She looked at the road ahead. She looked at the king, riding at the head of his column, with his left shoulder held carefully and his face turned south, and the last traces of 9 years of war settling into the lines of his body like dust into armor joints, waiting to be cleaned. She would clean it. She would clean all of it. Not the iron, though she would tend that too. The deeper grime, the blood that had soaked through the plate and into the man beneath, the old scars and the new ones and the ones that had not yet formed but would, because living meant bleeding, and bleeding meant someone needed to be there with steady hands and clean water and the patience to work the damage free. She was that someone. She had always been that someone. The war had not made her. The armor had not defined her. The king had not rescued her. She had walked into a camp with nothing but a braid and a knife and hands that knew what blood meant, and she had knelt in the mud and cleaned what needed cleaning until the world rearranged itself around the simple, stubborn truth that care was its own kind of power. The column moved south, the road unspooled. Dara's hands rested in her lap, ready,